March. The news from Khe Sanh that Walter Cronkite reported each night kept getting grimmer. The 5,000 Marines that were cut off and could get supplies only by air, even though any helicopter that flew over took a lot of enemy fire from the 20,000 surrounding Viet Cong troops. Meanwhile, the Marines were dug into bunkers covered with 3 feet of earth to protect them from the mortar shells that the Viet Cong were lobbing into the camp. About 500 mortar shells a day. And when they weren't lobbing shells, the Viet Cong were digging tunnels so that they could use to put explosives beneath their Marines. Some reports said that the tunnels were only 100 yards away from the barbed wire around the Khe Sanh base. The Marines had started to use stethoscopes and divining rods to see if they could find them. You know things are bad when the United States Marine Corps is using stethoscopes and divining rods. Still, the White House announced that the enemy offensive was running out of steam, that casualties at Khe Sanh were light, that we would never get up the Marine base there. We watched Walter Cronkite together every night after supper now, even my sister. We were all quiet, and not just because my father would have hollered if anyone had interrupted Walter Cronkite. Sometimes, though, my father himself would shake his head and whisper, 5,000 boys trapped. Good Lord, 5,000. We'd watch the pictures of the Marines in their zigzagging trenches or deep in their bunkers, holding their hands over their ears inside their helmets because of the thunder of the mortar shells. Then my father would reach for my mother's hand, and they would look at each other. My sister sat rigid, with anger, I guess. She probably wanted to say something like, "I told you so," or "if President Johnson had listened and gotten us out of there in time," or "no one in Washington knows what he's doing," but she didn't. When 500 mortar shells are coming in every day on top of soldiers huddled in holes with their hands over their ears, even a flower child who wanted nothing but world peace could only watch and hope. I also was watching the newscasts and hoping for a sign, any sign, of Lieutenant Tybalt Baker. There never was one, not in any of the films of the mortars or the trenches, or the downed and burning helicopters, or the wounded. Walter Cronkite didn't read off the names of the missing in action, so Lieutenant Baker was never mentioned. But I still watched anyway, holding my breath, hoping. Which is what I think the whole town was doing. Which is certainly what Mrs. Baker was doing. But you would never have been able to tell that she was holding her breath at Camillo Junior High. She moved through our classroom as coolly as if Khe Sanh were just a proper noun in a sentence that needed to be diagrammed. It was early spring, and we were her garden, and she was starting to see the bulbs and seeds that she had planted in us last fall coming up. She raked away our dead leaves, spaded new soil around us, and watered and fertilized. And we grew fast and green, let me tell you, especially my T, who is now the best sentence diagrammer in the 7th grade, which may not sound like much, but with Mrs. Baker, it was a big deal. During class, it didn't seem as if anything was bothering Mrs. Baker at all. Except maybe the 8 bulging asbestos ceiling tiles, which now had about as much bulge as asbestos ceiling tiles can take. They looked like sails in a full breeze. We still didn't know exactly what was making them so heavy. Maybe the rats were hoarding supplies for the summer drought up there. Maybe Sycorax and Caliban were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But whatever it was, No one wanted those tiles to come down with whatever was bulging them out, not even Danny Hupfer. Which was why, on the first Wednesday afternoon in March, while Mrs. Baker was grading, and I was at my desk starting in on Julius Caesar, who, let me tell you, was a whole lot smarter than Romeo, even though he ended up pretty badly too, Mr. Van Larry came in with a ladder, 8 new asbestos ceiling tiles, and a heavy mallet. Mrs. Baker looked at him. "A mallet?" she said. He brandished it in the air like Julius Caesar himself. "You don't know how big a rat on the loose can get in 5 months," he said. Mrs. Baker looked up at the bulging ceiling tiles. "I have some idea," she said. Mr. Van Larry set his ladder underneath one of the bulges. He steadied it and grabbed his mallet tightly in his right hand. He took 3 steps up the ladder. Then, with his left hand, he slowly reached up to one of the bulging tiles. He tapped it a couple of times, and we listened. Nothing. He pushed against it. Nothing. He hit it lightly with the mallet. Still nothing. He came back down the ladder and went over to the corner of the room. He picked up the trash can and came back to the foot of the ladder. "I'll need someone to hold this underneath the tile when I take it off, just in case stuff comes out," he said. "Just in case stuff comes out?" said Mrs. Baker. "That's right," said Mr. Van Larry. Mrs. Baker looked over at me. Sometimes I think she still hates my guts. So there I was, holding this trash can underneath the 8 bulging asbestos ceiling tiles, and Mr. Van Larry started to push up on one of them with his mallet. "You won't catch the stuff standing over there," he said to me. I moved a little closer. "Right here," he said, pointing to the target area. Then he turned and lifted one of the ceiling tiles with his mallet. We listened for the scrambling of 2 large rats. Nothing. So Mr. Van Larry tilted the tile to get it out, and shredded everything came pouring down. Homework announcements, PTA letters home, blue dittos, bazooka bubblegum wrappers. These were from Danny. Chewed up number 2 pencils, red and green and blue and yellow construction paper, napkins from the cafeteria, part of a black sneaker. This was from Doug Switek, who had been looking for it for a couple of months. A gnawed picture of me leaping across the stage in yellow tights, and scraps of Merrill Lee's Mississippi River and You project. It all came down like wet snow. "Hold the trash can under it," hollered Mr. Van Larry, which is exactly what I was doing, except that the stuff was also falling into my eyes and hair and down the back of my shirt. And I think I must have started screaming because Mrs. Baker came and took the trash can from me. "Maybe you should find a different way to collect the refuse," she said to Mr. Van Larry, brushing the rat-chewed stuff off of me. By the time Mr. Van Larry brought back a tarp, I had pretty much gotten my shaking under control. He handed me that mallet. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. "Swing at anything that has yellow teeth," he said. "Oh," I said quietly. I wasn't sure if that was better than having the rat-chewed stuff come down on my head. But even though I started to shake again, I held the mallet over my shoulder, ready to strike, which you have to admit is not only brave and courageous and true and blue and worthy of Jim Hawkins himself, but also pretty remarkable, considering I still had rat-chewed stuff in my hair and down my back. But we never saw Sycorax or Caliban. Mr. Van Larry replaced the bulging ceiling tiles with 8 new ones, then stepped from the ladder and stood back. "Good as new," he said. "Are you sure?" asked Mrs. Baker. "I'm sure," I willed him to say. I'm sure. "I'm sure," said Mr. Van Larry. "Then," said Mrs. Baker to me, "you may return to Julius Caesar." And we're at the top of 161. But let me tell you, it's not easy to read a Shakespeare play when you've just been holding a mallet over your shoulder, ready to swing at anything that has yellow teeth. And Mr. Van Larry is still poking at the other tiles to see if they were bulging too, and knowing that any tile could come crashing to the floor along with Sycorax and Caliban, and they would not be happy, let me tell you. I wanted to read Julius Caesar standing on my desk, but that would definitely not have been worthy of Jim Hawkins. When he finally left, Mr. Van Larry told us he'd come check on the new asbestos ceiling tiles tomorrow. Thank you, said Mrs. Baker. Then she went back to her grading. I wondered if she had wanted to stand on her desk too. Grading, by the way, is also something that makes it hard to read Shakespeare. When your teacher is covering papers with red ink a few desks away from you, and you know that yours is in the stack, and it's probably coming up soon, and that your grasp of non-restrictive clauses might not all be all that it should be. It's hard to read anything. Even though there was some good stuff in Julius Caesar. You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things. It doesn't have the cut of a Caliban curse, but it's all right. It also didn't help that Mrs. Baker kept wiping at her eyes during her grading. She told us that she had a terrible cold, but she hardly needed to tell us. Her eyes were mostly red all the time, and the way she blew her nose could be pretty impressive. Sometimes, while sitting at her desk, she just stopped doing whatever she was doing and looked somewhere far away, like she wasn't even in the classroom anymore. It was a terrible cold, and day after day it kept on, and even seemed to be getting worse. Merrill Lee said that she was up to half a box of Kleenex per class, which has got to be some kind of world record. So when she announced on Friday that members of the school board were coming to our room to observe and evaluate classroom performance by both students and their teacher, she told us in a soggy voice that drowned at the end. But drowning or not, she kept going. She was Mrs. Baker. I will expect you all to be polite to the school board members. I will expect you to be on your very best behavior. I will expect you to show, in an appropriate manner, what you have been studying this school year. When are they coming? Asked Merrill Lee. Before I tell you what Mrs. Baker said, I have something else to tell you because you won't believe what happened otherwise if I don't. When Julius Caesar is coming into Rome, which is a place where very bad things will happen to him, this soothsayer comes up to him to tell him what's going to happen. And this is what he says to Julius Caesar. Beware the Ides of March. So now I'll tell you what happened after Merrill Lee asked, when are they coming? Beware the Ides of March, I said. And Mrs. Baker looked at me, and her eyes opened a little bit. And without looking away from me, she said to Merrill Lee, a week from today, Miss Kowalski, which was the Ides of March. You are a soothsayer, Mr. Hood, said Mrs. Baker. Sometimes I scare even myself, I said. Prophecy is not an unalloyed gift, she said. Be careful how you use it, which is a teacher strategy to get you to look up the word unalloyed, which I did, and it still didn't make much sense. But what happened later that day was even weirder. In gym, Coach Quattrini announced that he was planning to form the Camillo Junior High School cross-country team. It wouldn't be a regular team since cross-country was a fall sport, but he wanted to start the 7th and 8th graders now so that he could choose a varsity team and have them run over the summer and be ready to begin real competition by September. He expected everybody to try out, everybody, and to get us started in our training, we would be running 2 miles at tempo. What's at tempo? I asked. Race pace, he said. How bad could that be? I said.